Okay. So why do we tell, we're talking about World War II statistics, and answering the question, the essential question of, what is the essential question? Based on casualty statistics, what events and nations should be at the center of the story of World War II? All right, so, Santana, thank you. The reason that in history, we tell stories is to give meaning to the past and to kind of connect us to the past. But the reason why numbers are helpful when you're telling a story is that it gives you a sense of scale. So if you say, the man waited for his future wife in the coffee shop every day until she arrived. That's like a sentence, right? How long is that? But we know he waited every day, but we don't know how long he waited. If you say the man waited for his future wife in the coffee shop every day for 10 years until she arrived, then that gives you like a sense of how long that waiting period was, right? It changes the meaning of the sentence. It changes the meaning of the story. When we talk about World War II, there is one big true thing about World War II that's important to remember, why it's the center in so many ways of our curriculum for this second semester. World War II is the deadliest conflict in human history. More people perished in this period of time than at any other time in world history. We've had a lot of wars, and there's been a lot of a loss of life in the past. Percentage-wise of the global population, there are conflicts in the past in ancient China, and also, say, the mass death of Native Americans when Europeans arrived and there was a wave of disease. So there have been instances where more percentage of people have been lost, but numerically, just the total number of lives lost, it's never been worse than World War II. But when we look at the statistics of casualties is a term that means both deaths and injuries. We see a large number of people in World War II were not soldiers, but were civilians. And the story that you often get told, and that you will be told again in next year when you're learning American history, is about America's entry into the war, Pearl Harbor. We go off to Europe, we invade through D-Day. You know, it's the Saving Private Ryan. You know, think of that film. They charge onto the beaches and they fight the Germans. They fight their way through Italy up till Berlin, and the Soviets meet us in Germany, and we end the war. That's one important part of the story. Then there's, of course, the Asian or the Pacific theater, where we're island hopping till we get to the close to the Japanese mainland. We drop the nuclear weapons, we end the war there. So that's kind of the story of World War II that you often get told. But when we look at the statistics, the question I want you to think about is, where should this story actually be centered? Where should the story be told from the perspective just of the sheer volume, the number of lives lost? So on your Google Classroom, there's a link to a website, fallen.io/WW2. It is this presentation that we're going to watch a section of, and there's an interactive graph on that website. So I'm hopeful that that will work. I'm not entirely sure if it will, but hopefully you'll be able to use that interactive graph to answer the questions in the worksheet. However, while this is playing, what you can do is you can write down the answers to your worksheet questions as well. I'm asking you to identify 6 countries and how many casualties they suffered in World War II. So think of the major players. Who were some of the major countries involved in World War II? Germany was certainly one of them. Who else was in World War II? Who else was a major country fighting World War II? The French? Calvin? Russia, yes. But what were they called at that time?
Soviet Army.
Or the Soviet Union or the USSR, right? So we've got the Soviet Union, we have Germany, we have France. Japan is another one. How about the good old US of A? Throw us in there too. Probably an important country to mention. But numerically, see how important we were, relatively speaking, in terms of the number of casualties suffered. England is another one. England fought through the whole war. They maintained their independence as a small island. Italy, yep, absolutely. So again, think of those are the kind of countries that you're looking for answers to these questions for. And then when you have those statistics, you've got a couple of the major players, then I want you to answer that essential question based on the numbers. Where should the story be centered? What story should we really focus on to tell an accurate picture of the war? All right, can I get the lights, please? All right, so this will play, we're gonna go till about, about 7.5 minutes in.
The average lifespan of...
What was your question? We're watching the video first. You, like I said, you should be able to get some of the answers to your questions as the video goes, but once the video is over after 7.5 minutes, then use the interactive graph to try to answer the rest of the worksheet.
An American is 80 years, and an 80-year-old today was 10 when World War II ended, 4 when it began. A soldier who saw battle would have to be in his late 80s, at least today. Generals, political leaders, the decision makers of the war, few are still with us. And over the past few decades, we've seen authors and filmmakers rush to capture stories from survivors before this connection of memory is lost. This project is not about individual war stories, and it's not about survivors. We're going to tally up the tens of millions of people whose lives were cut short by the war, and see how these numbers stack up to other wars in history, including trends in recent conflicts. We'll be counting soldiers and civilians separately. Each of these figures represents 1,000 people who died. Civilians were of all walks of life, whereas military deaths were almost entirely men. The average age was about 23. In most battles, for every 1,000 soldiers killed, there are more than 1,000 who were injured. The word casualty can be confusing because in military speak, it often includes both deaths and injuries, and anything else that takes a soldier out of service. Here, we're just counting the deaths, and we'll begin with American soldiers. Over 400,000 died. Most of the deaths occurred in the European theater, fighting the Nazis.
Okay, so let's just focus here. Fellas in the back, try not to goof around too much. Just pay attention now to the ratio, right? The size of this column. This is the European theater, this is the Pacific theater. Yes, you had a question, Shayla? Shayla, do you have a question?
Do you put American soldiers for like the nation?
Do you do what?
You put American soldiers for the nation?
For the nation, I would just write the United States of America, USA, or Germany, or USSR, Russia, Soviet Union. But I'm just trying to give you guys a sense of how they're representing data here. So each one of these people is 1,000 deaths, each one of these little figures. And they're stacking them in a column. And then he's able to separate the column into these sections to show you that this was the Pacific theater. This is the Americans fighting against the Japanese. And this is the European theater. This is the Americans fighting against the Nazis in Italy, in Germany, in France, etc. And just see the ratio of American deaths. So more Americans fought and died in Europe than in the Pacific.
And about a quarter were in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese. When you put them...
All right. Now this is a timeline. So he's going to show the deaths not only in a vertical column of just total number of people died, he's going to lay it on its side, and he's going to show you over time, when did these deaths occur? So let's start all the way back here. And let me get your eyes, folks. We've got too many people looking at their screens right now. Faith? Why do you think this is the American deaths in World War II? This is a timeline that goes to the end of the war, and it starts at the beginning for the Americans. So why do you think there's this bump? Why this number of people here? And remember, each figure accounts for 1,000 people. How many figures do we have here? got a row of 3 by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So about 18,000, right? So what event was happening there? This is all the way back in, actually they're listing this in May of 1942. But let's go even further back. What was the start of World War II for the Americans? I'll give you a hint, it happened in Hawaii. Pearl Harbor. And I forget actually what the main event in May was, so I'll have to brush up on that. But do you see how there's really not, I mean, there are deaths, American deaths that occur throughout 1942 and 43, but relatively few. But all of a sudden here, in June in 1944, we see this huge bump in the number of American deaths, right? And this continues all the way into the end of the war. So this is the period where the majority of American deaths occur. Do we remember which theater the majority of American deaths occurred in? The European or the Pacific? The majority. The European. So the majority of American deaths happen in the European theater. The majority happen on this timeline. What's that? Yeah. The majority happen on this timeline starting in June of 1944. So what do we think, what event do we think is happening in June of 1944 that begins this enormous amount of loss of life? First of all, where do we think it's happening? Yep, Calvin?
Was it invading Germany? Or not invading Germany, but the attack on Germany? Or Europe?
Sure, so it is in Europe. It is the invasion of Europe. There is a major event that starts this in June 6, 1944. Does anybody know when the Americans began their invasion of Europe? What was the main event? Calvin?
D-Day?
D-Day, it's called. D-Day was the invasion of Europe by an amphibious, like a sea-based landing. The troops all stormed in and took the shores. They took the beaches in Normandy, France, and it was an enormously costly invasion. 1 million men were organized. Ships, troop transports, planes, artillery. I mean, it was just this enormous effort to push onshore. The Germans were essentially ready for us, machine guns armed and pointed right at us. So there was an enormous loss of life, but an overwhelming force, an overwhelming, essentially logistical effort by our general, who was General Eisenhower at the time, Supreme Allied Expeditionary Force Commander. Yes? Bathroom? Yeah, that's fine. So this is how these statistics are being represented. I just want to give you like a clear example. You're going to see a vertical column every now and again. You're also going to see horizontal numbers, and that's going to be the timeline.
So on the timeline, you see that casualties were the heaviest at the end of the war. The war began on September 1st, 1939. But the U.S. wasn't willing to join the fight until Pearl Harbor, 2 years in. The deaths increased drastically on D-Day, when the Allies invaded Normandy.
Oh no. Ugh. This is a terrible error. Because it typically means I have to reset the whole thing. Yeah, that really.
Just run it correctly.
It may work, yeah.
The war began on September 1st, 1939. But the U.S. wasn't willing to join the fight until Pearl Harbor, 2 years in. The deaths increased drastically on D-Day, when the Allies invaded Normandy. One of the most tragic moments of the war was on D-Day at Omaha Beach, where 2,500 Americans fell. So about the same number of U.S. soldiers died on this single beach landing as the entire 13 years of the recent war in Afghanistan. The bloodiest battle in the Pacific was Okinawa, which lasted 82 days, during which 12,500 Americans died. about 5,000 of these deaths were at sea from kamikaze attacks. Now let's look at some other countries, starting with Europe. Germany started World War II when it invaded Poland. Poland ultimately lost 200,000 soldiers in the war. Most died after the invasion while the country was occupied by Germany and the Soviet Union. Germany, meanwhile, lost just 16,000 in the invasion of Poland. The Nazis went on to invade and conquer other countries, including Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Greece, and Yugoslavia. France surrendered, but after losing 92,000 soldiers in the Battle of France. Over 200,000 ultimately fell, which includes deaths in POW camps, French colonies, and other fighting. Yugoslavia suffered almost 500,000 military deaths. The initial invasion brought relatively few casualties on both sides, but the deaths mounted under Nazi occupation due to guerrilla fighting, civil conflict, and mass executions. The Nazi invasions were swift, with relatively few German losses. Even the Nazi commanders expressed surprise at their success. And then we have the United Kingdom and the United States, who were not invaded, but took the fight to the Nazis. Britain lost about the same number of soldiers as the US, which includes the British colonies. Germany lost about 500,000 soldiers fighting the US and Britain, in what is known as the Western Front, which took place in France and Belgium.
Okay, so I'm going to pause here because what's going to come next is pretty dramatic. So what you've seen so far then, this is the story of World War II we're used to hearing, is Germany takes over all of these European countries in this swift blitzkrieg warfare. They storm in, they take over Poland, they take over Yugoslavia, France surrenders famously, and the Germans have essentially taken over Europe. Then the Americans and the Brits fight the Germans in the Western Front and eventually defeat the Nazis, right? So this is the story as you're used to hearing it. Yes? Bathroom? Yeah, that's fine.
But most Nazi soldiers died in the Eastern Front, Germany's unsuccessful invasion of the Soviet Union.
All right, so watch this.
The numbers are staggering. The most famous battle of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the turning point of the European war, was Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army successfully took Stalingrad, but then got surrounded by the Soviets and cut off from food and ammunition. 500,000 Nazis would ultimately die in Stalingrad. Another 100,000 were taken prisoner, of which 6,000 would ever return. POWs had a low survival rate throughout World War II, and it was particularly grim in the East. When you include these POWs, roughly the same number of Germans died in Stalingrad as all the Western Front fighting against France, the UK, and the US.
All right, so they gave that little statistic. So again, look at the visual size of these blocks, right? This is how much Germany lost fighting in the Western Front, fighting the Americans and the Brits. In one battle, this is how much they lost fighting the Russians, right? And Stalingrad was a siege. Do we know what the word siege means? Anybody know about medieval warfare? Anybody seen Lord of the Rings lately? The Siege of Minas Tirith? So a siege in the medieval times was when you'd stay behind your castle walls, the opposing army would come up, and they'd be throwing things at you with catapults, trebuchets. You'd be inside the walls, you'd be waiting, like holding out for as long as you had food and supplies to survive, and you would hope one side or the other would exhaust themselves and run out of supplies. So in Stalingrad, the German army charged in, fought the Soviets, and at some point they were both locked in to this city, and the Germans couldn't get out. Eventually the Germans lose, and 100,000 of them are taken prisoner, and only 6,000 of them make it back to Germany. So from 100,000 people who had survived the fighting of Stalingrad, 94,000 then died afterwards as POWs. And that's because the Soviets were particularly cruel in their treatment of prisoner wars.
And though Stalingrad was a victory for the Soviets, they suffered almost twice as many losses as Germany. The Soviet Union would eventually defeat the once unstoppable German army, killing 2.3 million Nazi soldiers. But winning the war came at a cost.
You guys seeing this?
$8.7 million is the official tally by the Russian military, a hotly disputed number. Some studies have calculated as many as 14 million dead.
So I'm going to go back just 1 second. So I mean, this kind of gives you a sense of what we're talking about here. That's Poland. Poor Poland. They got, 200,000 people killed down there. I think that was Yugoslavia. That might have been France. Britain and America down here. And then you have Germany, which obviously lost an enormous number of people. They were the primary belligerents, the primary people fighting. This is the Russians. I mean, the scale is just unbelievable. So around this stage, it's going to give you time to go back to your interactive graph. Do that, fill out the first hard part of the worksheet, and then you'll be able to answer the essential question. I think this just goes for another 30 seconds or so.
To complete the count of European military deaths, we need to add German deaths from other fronts, including the North and Africa, as well as deaths from other Axis powers allied with the Nazis, Hungary, Romania, and Italy. When you put these European military deaths on the timeline, it looks like this. You can now interact with the chart to learn more.
All right, and I'll pause here just so you these are what's called stacked bar charts. So it's a bar chart, like in the sense that each one of these is a bar, vertically tall based on how many it represents. And they've decided to stack them on top of each other. I don't know exactly what order they put them in. They did put the Americans at the bottom, they put the Russians at the top. I'm not entirely, I assume so that you can kind of see all the individual countries. But on the website, you should be able to move your mouse over one of the country colors, and it will tell you the total country's losses. And as you move down the timeline, remember this is on the timeline as well, it should show you some of the major battles that are happening. You're going to want to look for the big name battles. To kind of quickly check those, you might want to go over to Wikipedia and type in the name of the battle and see if it was one of the really big ones. But you're obviously going to see a huge, like a couple of these peaks here that'll indicate some of the major moments. For example, I want to say Stalingrad is in this period, and then there's a gap between the Soviet and German deaths, but those spike again a little later on. That's the Battle of Kursk, which is a very important tank battle. Yeah. All right. So just complete those worksheets and write the essential question.